TV Guide keeps you plugged in.
No, I'll get there. Pictures of the big hole in the ground.
Good evening. I'd like to thank everyone for coming, first of all, and the weather especially. My name is Greg Corbett. I'm a student associate at the Institute of Politics. That's the undergraduate affiliate of the Institute of Politics. We are a co-sponsor of the Forum on Terrorism. We hope that you will enjoy tonight's discussion on Are We Still Safe from Terrorism? We hope to present a number of different views from alternate viewpoints. We have someone here from the Federal Bureau of Investigation for a viewpoint from intelligence. We have someone here from a professor at Boston University for an education view. We also have someone in investigative correspondent for CNN for a view from the media. And we also have someone from the State Department. We're going to open this up to a short introduction for each of our members speaking tonight. They're going to tell a little bit about themselves and their own views on terrorism. After that, we're going to go to discussion between the panelists, and following that, if there are any questions from members of the audience, you may speak at one of the microphones and direct your questions either to the panel as a whole or to a particular member. I'm now going to turn this over to our moderator, Mr. Philip Zellico. He's Assistant Professor of Public Policy here at the John F. Kennedy School of Government. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. And I'd like to thank the Institute of Politics for making this event possible. The subject for tonight is terrorism. I don't need to tell you why some people might have thought this was a newsworthy subject about which folks might be interested. We have an outstanding panel tonight. I'm simply chosen as a moderator. Let me just briefly introduce myself. I'm a professor here, as Greg pointed out, and before teaching at Harvard, I worked on the National Security Council staff for General Scowcroft during the Bush administration, had been a career Foreign Service officer with the State Department, and am now a consultant to the Office of the Secretary of Defense. I also used to be, many years ago, a trial lawyer who concerned himself with the criminal justice system from a different perspective. I think I'm here tonight mainly because I've written a Kennedy School case on Northern Ireland and have some research interests in internal security issues. But internal security is only one part of a continuum of issues on which international terrorism is at a very different part of that same continuum. There are a lot of different dimensions to this problem, and I think our panelists tonight can help us explore them. Beginning with Stephen Emerson, to my far right, who will start off for us tonight. Stephen Emerson is probably one of the most respected journalists in the United States, if not the world, in covering terrorism issues, especially terrorism and the Middle East. He's an award-winning Washington-based journalist, now working as an investigative correspondent for CNN, who writes frequently for the New York Times Magazine, Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and the New Republic. His 4 books include Terrorist, the inside story of the highest-ranking Iraqi terrorist ever to defect to the West, and The Fall of Pan Am 103, Inside the Lockerbie Investigation, probably, I think, considered the definitive work on that subject, Secret Warriors, Inside the Covert Military Operations of the Reagan Era, and The American House of Saud, The Secret Petrodollar Connection. Before coming to CNN, he had worked as national security correspondent and senior editor for U.S. News and World Report, and before that had been on Capitol Hill. So it's a pleasure to introduce Stephen Emerson.
I should have warned you that that press release was written by my mother, so I think I'm quite honored to be on this panel. It's the first time that I'm actually going to get a chance to ask on-the-record questions of Wayne Gilbert to my left over here. So usually he's dodging my questions in Washington, and so hopefully Wayne will recognize me as one of the questioners. My area of expertise, and I caution it's not really expertise but rather specialization, is from the perspective of the media. As you know, CNN particularly has now become sort of the network of crisis. So anytime there is an incident that occurs around the world, CNN is there. CNN liked to brag that the Persian Gulf War was its war, and it used many compliments by the Secretary of Defense, Richard Cheney, and Saddam Hussein, who said that they wanted to find, when they wanted to find out what was happening, they didn't ask their diplomats, they just tuned into CNN. Having said that, however, there's a downside to having CNN as the network of instant coverage. And I say this even though this is on the record, and this is being videotaped, so this could be the last speech I say as a CNN correspondent. But there are times when CNN ought to exercise self-censorship and restraint when it doesn't. And I think in areas of terrorism, particularly when the agenda of a terrorist is to maximize publicity and to engender fear and panic among the general population, there is no better magnifying lens than CNN than in magnifying the entire effect psychologically of that terrorist act. And to the extent that CNN ends up covering a terrorist act without any type of restrictions, and I'm not using any particular example here yet, I'll save that for our comments later, CNN ends up unwittingly abetting the interests of the terrorists in terms of creating a psychological climate around the world, not just in the particular community where the terrorist act is held. Now, going back to the role of TV, just one particular episode I'd like to remind our audience of that brings to mind the recklessness of television in covering terrorism was in July 1985 in the Twa hijacking that occurred in Beirut. And that hijacking was carried out by members of the Hezbollah and Lebanese group Amal, and they took the American passengers off the plane and put them in different safe houses in Beirut. The terrorists then paraded the American hostages before the networks every single day in Lebanon, and they essentially ended up producing the daily packages for all the major American networks. So much so that Hezbollah terrorists were actually assigning which reporters would get the exclusive interviews, and were actually deciding on what grounds the media would be, the networks would be covering it, such as deciding whether it would be pooled coverage, shared coverage, exclusive coverage. So I always thought that at the end of those specials during that hijacking, the network should have credited Nabi Berri and some other Hezbollah Amal leaders as partly contributing correspondents for the terrorist event. That's one area that I think, especially as CNN becomes this global magnifying lens around the world, the ability to track almost any event. The Persian Gulf War, to the extent that CNN was restricted in covering certain aspects, means that the next time there's a war, you're going to have correspondents basically walking around with small video cameras and satellite transponders able to communicate from any place in the world, which means that the next time there's a terrorist act, no matter where it takes place, it could be televised within minutes around the world. That's going to be a problem. It may boost ratings, but it may make the problem of terrorism that much more difficult for the policymakers. Just as a quick aside here, the topic of tonight's discussion is, are we still safe from terrorism? Well, I would take issue with two words, are we and still. The we implies that because of the World Trade Center bombing and because of the relative immunity of terrorism to Americans on American soil, that somehow we have to take more cognizance of the problem. In fact, Americans probably have been more singled out overseas by terrorists than any other nationality. The Lockerbie incident wasn't more than 3 years ago. The Beirut bombings in the mid-1980s killed more than 500 Americans. The magnitude of attacks against Americans continues to this day overseas. So I would say that the reason that we are all of a sudden taking interest here is that it happened on our soil, when in fact, had there been a more consistent policy, a more definitive policy, and a less craven policy, we would not have the problem that we have today. And I think the problem we have today is severe. Severe because I think we have local homegrown groups that basically have established the U.S. as a major haven for terrorist acts that they are coordinating overseas in their home countries. But what is happening today is that they are increasingly likely to use the U.S. not just as a base by which they carry out the attacks and direct them overseas, but as in the World Trade Center bombing, to use the United States as a base, a place to carry out attacks here at home. I throw out those questions and I wait for the next speaker.
Whom I will now introduce. Our next speaker is Wayne Gilbert. Mr. Gilbert is in an excellent position to comment on Mr. Emerson's remarks, since he's a person who, as much as anyone, is responsible for dealing with the consequences of Mr. Emerson's questions. Wayne Gilbert is Assistant Director in the Federal Bureau of Investigation of its Intelligence Division. And as such, he is one of the key operational officials responsible for the FBI's task in combating terrorism. Mr. Gilbert is not new to the job in the FBI. He is a G-man. He's been in the FBI for 27.5 years, starting in 1965, and before his current job in the Intelligence Division, he'd been the Special Agent in Charge in Philadelphia, before that the Special Agent in Charge in Pittsburgh, and before that had held jobs at FBI headquarters and at other FBI offices in Oklahoma and elsewhere in the United States. So with that, let me turn this over to Mr. Gilbert.
Thank you. It's the individual who planned this conference on this topic has probably got better intelligence than we do. To have timed it in between Waco and the Trade Center bombing is quite incredible. And we're probably looking into that right now. We probably have a file open on that, I don't know. The FBI is in a unique position. We are the agency that conducts investigations involving terrorism here in the United States, both what we call domestic, which is homegrown, left, right, in between, way out, and international terrorist incidents here, and also support for international terrorist incidents within the United States. We're quite unique in that we are the cops, we are a law enforcement agency, and we're also an intelligence agency. We're part of the intelligence community. We're sort of a hybrid. There are not too many security agencies left in the world that have that dual mission. Most of them have been split into one or the other. We also have the unique distinction of having jurisdiction for terrorist incidents overseas that involve U.S. citizens or in some cases U.S. property. That was thanks to TWA 847 and a few other, and Achille Lauro and a few others in the mid-'80s. So in 84 and 86, Congress, in their infinite wisdom, passed laws that gave us jurisdiction overseas. And on any given day, I have a large contingent of agents, either from Washington, D.C., for Europe mainly. Miami covers South America, and Honolulu covers the Pacific. And they're out there conducting investigations at the host country's request in concurrence to U.S. standards, trying to gather evidence as a law enforcement agency to bring people back to the United States, if possible, to face trial, as happened today. As a matter of fact, that's what I've been doing for the last almost 30 hours, is working on the Trade Center bombing and having an individual return to the United States within the last 3 hours, as a matter of fact. We do it hopefully quietly. We have to deal with the media, and I personally, I've been at several major crisis incidents, from the Atlanta Federal Prison uprising in Talladega, and I really don't have a problem in dealing with the media. We just have to be smarter, we have to be a little brighter, and we have to be a little faster than CNN and some of our friends in the media. And sometimes we have problems. We have unfortunate leaks. Is an epidemic that's been around Washington for a long time, and that causes us a lot of problems because we have to deal in the rules of federal criminal procedure, and we have to deal in the rules of evidence. And it causes us many problems, as it has in the Trade Center bombing. I mean, it's been fairly well publicized that because of some advance notice to the media, some events took place in the trade bomb, and that's what we call it, trade bomb. We're great at code names. That's a real unique code name. That case, there were certain events that took place that we would like to have taken a little different timing But that's the facts of life. That's what you have to deal with. And terrorism is theater. That's what they want. And there's another whole question that Steve has raised. What role does the media play in that aim? But the fact is that terrorism in the United States from 82 to 92 has decreased substantially. Terrorist acts here in the United States have gone from in the 50s down to 4 last year, and even those we're reaching a little bit, calling them terrorist acts. And the predominant perpetrators of the terrorist acts in the last 10 years have been Puerto Rican independence groups, mostly down in Puerto Rico, but also here in the mainland. And most of those have been bombings. So we're somewhat experienced, unfortunately, at forensic crime scenes, although Pan Am 103 and the Trade Center bombing are probably the biggest crime scenes that we've ever been involved in. Pan Am 103 was an 850 square mile crime scene, the entire width of Scotland. And then the Trade Center bombing, they say it's wrapped up today, but it's not. We have another week or two of down in the hole, down in the sewerage and down in the water and all the things that you have to do for a crime scene. But we've reconstructed 40 or 50% of the band, and that's what we do best. But more importantly, we also prevent incidents, and that's the ideal thing that we try to do, is gather the intelligence shared throughout the world and prevent incidents of terrorism. That, we feel real good, and a lot of those you don't hear about, and that's what we do for a living. And I'll throw it back and wait for the stirring of the pot.
Let me turn the chair over now to Dr. Ellie Krakowski. Dr. Krakowski is both a policy practitioner in the terrorism field and now bringing that policy expertise to bear from academia. He's an associate professor of international relations and law at the International Relations Department at Boston University, where he's been for about 4.5 years. There he is trying to systematically develop the study of low-intensity conflict as an academic topic within Boston University, actually pursuing the same agenda he was pursuing when he was in the government in the 1980s, serving at the Pentagon in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, working for Assistant Secretary Pearl, and as an office director, trying to develop a clear identification of the policy problems uniquely and distinctively associated with terrorism and low-intensity conflict as a focus for defense policy. Dr. Krakowski.
Well, thank you very much. The previous speakers have addressed the topic in a somewhat more general fashion. I am going to try to go to the theme of the evening as I understand it. Are we still safe from terrorism? And here I would start by agreeing completely with Steve Emerson. The word still and the word we. I think that the fact that the United States has been safe from terrorism is, I think, probably no accident. And what I want to address is that particular question and place the issue of the World Trade Center in the sort of a geostrategic context. Because, and I think the investigative agencies and the FBI have not yet spoken about those links, and I think for very good reasons. They have to limit themselves to the available evidence, but I think that that already now begins to go in a much broader direction. The fact that the United States has been safe, relatively speaking, is not really due to the efficiency of the FBI, and I am a very big admirer, I think, of their efficiency, their effectiveness, and I think they have shown recently just how good they are. But I think it is partly because terrorists themselves have generally shied away from attacking the United States itself. They have attacked, as Steve pointed out, Americans and American interests abroad. All of that is connected to political agendas of eliminating American influence and American presence in various areas. The World Trade Center, no one really has taken responsibility for. And some people have asked me, well, what is that? What does that mean? And I have answered this is not the first time that people have not taken responsibility for particularly big terrorist incidents. But there is a political objective, and I think the political objective here is tied to Iran. I think Iran is behind the World Trade Center, as it has been behind the attack on the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires in March of 1992. I think that even the attack at the gates of the CIA headquarters may have some very real state sponsorship behind it. I think the attack on the Israeli embassy may have been the dry run for a new wave of terrorism. The MO, though not quite exactly the same, the spectacular big bomb, though, is similar. Now, the question is that the people involved so far, while having connections with militant Islam or fundamentalists, as people have it, do not have explicit connections with Iran. And I don't know whether such connections ever will be forthcoming in the sense of full legal proof. But that's part of the game. In other words, a state sponsor wants to draw a message, to send a message. They do not want to be so clearly identified with a message as to enable easy retaliation. And I think that the partly amateurish, but I think in fact probably fairly professional type of backing behind this incident indicates just that. The creation of a buffer so as to convey a certain message, and I think the message is generally being conveyed already. People are speculating, and that's basically what is happening. Iran, I think, is going on the offensive so as to better allow itself, its objectives to be fulfilled in the regional sense, that is to say, towards the former Soviet states in the Middle East, Persian Gulf area, sabotaging the peace process in the Arab-Israeli talks, and so forth. And I think that the message is very consonant with the kind of rhetoric that the Iranian leadership has been spouting in the last 2-3 years, and that is to say, death to America, and basically forcing a withdrawal of the United States from the entire region, that is to say the Persian Gulf, Middle East, so as to allow Iranian dominance in that area. The reason that I think this type of event is occurring is precisely because Iran considers that the United States has relegated terrorism to a fairly secondary position from the standpoint of policy and from the standpoint of action. That is to say, despite very heavy rhetoric, despite statements that the United States takes terrorism and state sponsorship of terrorism very seriously from the standpoint of action and from the standpoint of prevention or getting to the root of the problem, the United States has basically avoided, and the examples, I think, for that are legion. And therefore, I think the Iranians believe that the United States may in fact speak a great deal, may in fact go from the standpoint of law enforcement or catching the immediate culprits, but that from the standpoint of going further than that, it will not, and that perhaps this will serve to make the United States just a little more timid about pushing its own agendas in the Middle East. And I think I will stop so as not to take any more time.
Thank you. And our next panelist is David Long. Dr. Long is a specialist on the Middle East and on terrorism. He is currently an associate of CNO Resources in Washington, D.C., and a consultant to the King Faisal Foundation in Riyadh. But he has a background of 30 years as a Foreign Service officer in the State Department. While at the State Department, he served throughout the length and breadth of the Arab world in Sudan, Morocco, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan, with an academic background that includes a PhD in International Relations from George Washington University. He has served in the State Department in Washington in the Office of Counterterrorism and also in the Bureau of Intelligence and Research handling Near Eastern issues. And he currently continues his work on both the Middle East and terrorist problems. Dr. Long?
Thank you. I might add on on an educational note that I spent a year at Fletcher School up the road, and it was really very much of a professional school, and I fancied myself more academic at the time, so I came down to Harvard and I asked them, you know, could I get in? And that was back a long time ago when it was easier than it is now, and they said, sure, we'll fix you up, no problem, we'll get you an assistantship and blah, 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 blah. And I already had 2 master's degrees by that time, one at Fletcher and one at UNC, North Carolina. And I said, well, how long will it take me to get through the comps? And they said, oh, another 4 years, easy. And so I joined the Foreign Service. And I thought of that today coming in from Washington, because I knew that Harvard had a lot of influence with Democrats, but I really didn't realize that the new Clinton administration had singled out Cambridge to start its war on global warming until I got here this afternoon. Gee, it's still spring down in Washington. What I want to do is very, very briefly try to muddle the waters a little bit more. I think that in many ways terrorism is like the 4 blind men who were trying to describe an elephant. You know, one was at the side and said it's like a wall, and the other had the tail and said it's like a snake. You've heard this. And the feet are like trees and so forth. But terrorism is very much the same way. There really is very little commonality of all the parts that you can take and create a single conceptual framework. I know I wrote a book trying to do this after being operational for 4 years, at a time that Wayne remembers very well, in the middle 80s. I went over to Georgetown University and tried to think about what I've been doing, because nobody had any time to think while you were doing it. And it was really very difficult. There are so many aspects to them, and they're not that closely associated. Terrorism is basically a political problem. The thing that distinguishes it from, say, a hostage situation and a marital situation, okay, you know, the estranged husband has the kid with a gun in his face, is that terrorism? Well, you could say it was, but it is not what we're talking about here tonight. And the difference is basically the political element has to be added before it becomes terrorism as we're speaking of it tonight, rather than a domestic problem. But every other way, it's identical. So it is a political problem, and because it is, it involves politicians. And it not only involves politicians in our country, but in many countries. And this is what I mainly did as a diplomat, was try to persuade other countries that this was really not one country's problem, but it was every country's problem. And that if there was not a multinational approach to anti-terrorism, we were not going to succeed. But terrorism is also a law enforcement problem. There is no terrorist act that is not against some law. We were talking earlier before the forum that there is no legal definition of terrorism, therefore there can't be a law against terrorism, because no countries can agree on what terrorism legally is. And that's because it's a political problem, not a legal problem. But it is a law enforcement problem because all the acts are illegal. Arson, bombing, murder, kidnapping, hijacking. So it is a law enforcement problem. And Wayne knows that very well. That's what he's been in the business of doing for a number of years. It's also a military problem. And we have a military person, a person who is in the Pentagon. If you ask a Pentagon person what terrorism is, they say, well, there's a spectrum from nuclear war to low-intensity conflict, and on the far end of low-intensity conflict is terrorism. So they look at it as one end of a spectrum of the use of force, which is a very valid way of looking at it, but a very different way of looking at it. And all of these are legitimate ways of looking at it, but they don't necessarily mesh very well. And then finally, there is the journalism part of it. Journalists perceive of themselves as recorders of events, but in terrorism, as Mr. Emerson very well put it, they're not just observers, they are participants, like it or not, because part of terrorist goals are to publicize what they're doing in order to get their agenda before a lot of people. And the media are the vehicle for doing that. So this raises some very tough professional and ethical questions for the media about how do you react as, like it or not, a participant as well as a recorder. And I think these are some of the things that Steve, you were talking about. And these are tough problems. I remember after the TWA case, the media had its own conference to ask itself some of these questions. So I submit that all of these are parts of the elephant. And the real difficult part is how do you put together an integrated policy as a government representing the people of America that can adequately look at all of these parts of the problem and still have a definable and coherent policy when you can't even defend what the policy is supposed to be about, since there isn't any definition of terrorism. I'm not sure. We can discuss that in the question and answer period. After all this time, I don't know what the answer is, but I would maintain one thing. I think that the best approach is not to single one or another or two of these aspects out, but to say, first of all, that any integrated policy has to be all of the above. You can't say, should you have law enforcement or should you have better diplomacy? You can't say, should you have a political solution or should you have more constraints on the media or less constraints? You have to look at all aspects. And then finally, I would say, to add into the optimism of the group, I don't think that we will see an end to terrorism in our lifetime. I believe that this is a phenomenon that is here to stay. After all you need is a rudimentary knowledge of chemistry and electronics, and you can put yourself into business at any Radio Shack and hardware store. The means of terrorism are too available and too cheap to deny everyone in the world who has a gripe. So the purpose of policy, I think, must be how can we most efficiently reduce the problem to manageable proportions. It is a management problem, not a solution problem. And with that, I'll quit.
Thanks. Let me explain the ground rules from here on. I'm going to make a couple of comments to try to offer the panelists some other opportunity to talk about things. But as we're talking, you should be thinking of the questions that you'd like to ask. And there is a microphone there and a microphone there. And if you come up with a question, just queue up at the microphones. And when it seems like we've talked ourselves out a little bit, I'll start recognizing you one at a time. When I do recognize you, please try to think about whether you'd like to direct your question to a particular panelist, and if so, say so. And when you do ask a question, please be sure to tell us who you are before you begin your question. With that, let me just make a couple of comments on the presentations and toss out some other questions for our panelists to consider. First, why are we as safe as we are? Could be one way of phrasing the question. Both Mr. Emerson and Mr. Krakowski said, well, really, we're not that safe because you need to consider the problems Americans overseas face. But of course, I think we would all agree that things could be much worse. If you look at what's happened in Bombay and Calcutta during the last month and think about what the press would be like here in the United States if we had in New York City what Bombay just experienced, I think it would make the World Trade Center press coverage look very modest by comparison. So the World Trade Center bombing may be bad, but clearly things could be far, far worse, which leads to the question, why aren't they worse? What exactly do we think is the reason for that? And if so, what is it that we're doing right, or what is it that we need to continue doing, or is that in jeopardy? A second question, which is related to the first, is what exactly are the challenges any of this presents for public policy? All right, it's a problem, and we want very good law enforcement and outstanding crime scene investigation, but what's the policy issue here? In the 80s, we knew what some of the policy issues here were. We had problems of international cooperation. France, in the Abdallah case, striking deals with Middle Eastern governments and not going after the terrorists. Greece, struggling with them to get them to try or extradite Rashid. Italy, and the difficulty over Abu Abbas, whom they let escape from Italy after the Achille Lauro hijacking. We knew what the problems were in international cooperation, but those don't seem to be as prominent today. In the 80s, we knew we had big problems with outlaw states. Libya, we all remember the bombing of Libya in 1986. Iraq, Syria, and of course the Pan Am 103 investigation, which has pointed at times at Syria and at Libya. Lebanon. But now the whole notion of dealing with outlaw states is no longer in the news, although the economic sanctions against Libya are in force, and some talk about jacking those up one notch further. But outlaw states don't seem to be a big policy issue in the 90s. Overseas jurisdiction. In the 80s, we were struggling with issues like the DEA in Mexico, or the Fawaz Yunus case of arresting him in the Mediterranean and bringing him back to the United States for trial. But that doesn't seem to be controversial anymore either. So what are the policy issues that we need to think about in the 1990s? What can we as students of public policy think about in terms of this problem that's useful? And finally, if we do think we have some suspects for, say, the World Trade Center bombing, if we think the finger points at Islamic fundamentalists or at Iran, what exactly is the political statement that these people are making? Is it if you think about what is the political statement from the World Trade Center bombing, maybe it's as simple as death to America, 5 Americans at a time. It's a slow process. But I think you can argue that this is not a very coherent political message, not very coherently delivered. Maybe that's all there is to it. It's as unfocused as a cry of pain. Or on the other hand, maybe there isn't a political statement being made here. Maybe the bombing of Pan Am 103 wasn't designed to make a political statement, but it was designed to do something for the people who ordered the bombing. They wanted to kill some people to serve their private mission, their private agenda, and they served that agenda. And whether or not the West got the political statement wasn't really that important, as long as they knew that they had done what they set out to do. So let's think a little bit more about what exactly would be the political statement that Islamic fundamentalists are making, and how is that connected to possible terrorist acts in North America. With those questions, let me throw those open to the panel, and I'd like to offer the first opportunity to comment to Dr. Long, since he has to leave early.
On the part of your question where you say, why don't we have more terrorism in this country? Wayne, remember when we used to worry about when the big one was going to come down because we had been safe so long, and then all of a sudden people were going to find out we were vulnerable because we knew it was going to happen. And it happened, and there wasn't much of a reaction, at least not to the magnitude that we kind of were speculating about back in the mid-'80s. I would suggest this, that you can take a bow. I think one of the reasons why there's relatively little terrorism in our country, there are a lot of other reasons, mind you, but one of the reasons is that terrorism is not tolerated in our society. Now, don't get me wrong, you have to have law enforcement, you have to have intelligence, you have to have a lot of things to keep our country safe. But terrorism is not, or is very seldom done in a vacuum. If you look around the world, most terrorist groups have a constituency of people who, though they are not terrorists themselves, are sympathetic at least with the agenda, if not with the tactics of the terrorists. There's a support group of varying degrees virtually everywhere you find terrorism rampant. And in our country, the whole notion of terrorist means being justified by any ends is just not there. So I would submit that one of the reasons, maybe not the biggest one, but one of the reasons why we have not experienced more terrorism than we have is because the American people just do not tolerate that kind of behavior among our social norms, and to the extent that they do in other societies, and we're very fortunate because of that, I believe.
Let me just add my 2 cents here. I think there are probably 2 reasons, as far as I could see, why the terrorism outbreak hasn't afflicted the U.S. homeland as much as it has afflicted the world at large. One is because of the very effective way that the FBI has been able to carry out its domestic counterterrorism efforts and counterintelligence efforts. And the second, and it's impossible to put a factor here, a quantifiable factor, is that groups essentially have not been willing to engender American enmity and ill will. And basically they know that if they push the U.S. too hard, it would result in a Libya 1986 Gaddafi-like bombing. So for all intents and purposes, terrorist groups, like anybody else, make political calculations. There's a cost to be paid for carrying out certain attacks. To a certain extent, that's why there was no claim of responsibility. If there was a claim of responsibility, we would have an address where we would drop our next B-17 bombs. The fact is that terrorists have made that decision. Now it appears, if we can call this act of terrorism in World Trade Center bombing a terrorist act, and I believe Wayne, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think the FBI has determined that it was an act of terrorism yet, officially.
It's officially listed as a suspected act of terrorism.
Okay, a suspected act of terrorism, but it hasn't been called an international act, well, for obvious reasons, because there hasn't been the causal international connections made. There are intelligence assessments, nevertheless, that basically lead people to believe that this was an act probably inspired by groups with international links. That being said, this now means that groups will probably have made the determination that now the American homeland is the place to strike. And that, I think, is a function of the fact that the U.S. response has been very sporadic, very mixed in the past 10 years overseas. Sometimes we react very strongly, like with Libya, and other times with Iran, we were willing to trade hostages and weapons to get our hostages back, basically a very craven attitude toward terrorism. There has never been a consistent attitude toward countering terrorism, and I think some terrorist groups might be making that calculation that this new administration might be hesitant to invoke very strong measures.
Would you all comment on that?
Well, yeah, I think one of the things that one should add with regard to terrorism is a differentiation between the ability to initiate some act or several acts of terrorism and the ability to maintain a terrorist presence. And I think what Dr. Long was talking about is in essence the ability to maintain. The ability to maintain you cannot have unless there is support for terror as a tool of action. And there are cultures that support that, and therefore terrorism can thrive in very many places around the world. In the United States, you don't. But there is the other side of the picture, and that is to say that terrorism, in terms of controlling it, if it is limited to the territory of a particular state, even democratic states can deal very effectively within the democratic structure with that. Where the problem comes in is if terrorist groups have international connections and are provided safe havens by others. That, I think, becomes a very real problem, and I think that that's the kind of situation we are facing in the United States now, and then the reason I stated earlier, I think that the perception, certainly on the part of Iran, is that the United States, with regard to Iran and Iranian sponsorship, has not been willing to exert any kind of meaningful pressure. And I think that they have assessed that now, with the collapse of the Soviet Union and a certain retranchement, a certain pulling back in the United States in terms of defense and other aspects of the problem, that it is a more congenial environment. I think here I want to connect this with the nuclear proliferation question. And let me just say this. If Iraq had the nuclear capability, which the Israelis destroyed back in '81, would the United States have gone in to remove the Iraqis from Kuwait? And I think the answer is no. And this is the issue you raised in terms of significance, I think we are entering into a very, very dangerous period. Some opinions have that the Iranians already have something of a nuclear capability, that they have been purchasing like crazy from the former Soviet Union, that they have had extensive dealing with North Korea. North Korea now withdrawing from the possibility of inspection by the International Atomic Energy Agency, either is on the verge or already may have nuclear weapons, and we are therefore now in a situation, or will shortly be, where a very effective blackmail can be, or certainly attempted towards the United States, with the belief of impunity.
Do you have any comment, Mr. Gilbert? Or?
Let me comment on the rationale, and I agree with all the points that have been made of why we have not seen a real large number of terrorist incidents in the United States. As a matter of fact, they've been declining, but they've also been declining worldwide for the last 5 or 6 years. But we have averaged around 50% of the terrorist acts overseas are directed at U.S. either property or U.S. citizens. And last year that declined to 39%, but it's still a very significant percentage. But there are a lot of practical reasons why they don't occur here as frequent as they do overseas. And so these are very direct and very logical reasons. One is that why travel all this way to do it when there are softer targets and many more of them involving the U.S. overseas? There are military bases everywhere. There are corporate headquarters all over the world that are U.S. oriented. So it's much easier for them to work in their emigre communities overseas than it is here, as they indicated. We don't support terrorist subcultures here very well. The lines of communication are a problem. If you're going to do an operation, the lines of communication are always a problem. And also, the people that generally get involved in these things are not the most educated. They're the lower end of the social scale in some of these state-sponsored countries. And when they come over here, they don't function very well, quite frankly. They see girls in short skirts. They see a lifestyle that's very, very foreign to them, that's very upsetting to them. They stand out like a sore thumb. It makes it much easier for us to counter them with our assets that we have out in the population. And we do that. We do that very legally, very concerned about the civil rights of all citizens. We have to very delicately walk that line between legitimate religious groups and Islamic fundamentalism. Is not all bad. I mean, there's a very small group of extremists that we have to deal with. And in the Trade Center bombing, believe me, it was a large bomb. I have a pretty good idea why it was done. It's something we can't discuss now there again because it's going to be a case that's going to be tried in open court. It's the same as Pan Am 103. The indictment on Pan Am 103 is very good reading. It gives a lot of the facts of that case, but not all the facts. There are a lot more facts that will come to light if and when we bring the two individuals back for trial. But those are among the reasons that they've articulated for the lack of terrorist incidents here. PIRA is a good example, the Provisional Irish Republican Army. Been very active in this city. One of the better trials that we've ever had was held here in this city. And I had part of it in Philadelphia. And there are individuals who are not going to commit a terrorist act here in the United States, but they sure would like to obtain as much technology as they can to export to where the battles are being fought over in Northern Ireland and in the UK. And you see a country there that is really in the throes of some very, very, very severe bombing along with India, and they've got real problems. We do not see that. We don't have any intelligence indicating that that's going to happen here in the United States, and I say that very, very firmly. We don't have any evidence. We don't have any intelligence indicating that. We have rumblings, we have suspicions, we have fears, just like anybody else, but we have no facts to support that. And in the case of the internationalization of the effort against terrorism, it has come light years, as Dr. Long indicated, from Wiesbaden, the hospital in Wiesbaden, when we were debriefing all the hostages coming out of Beirut. The events today, I think, demonstrate that, where we were able to reach out and touch an indicted individual in the World Trade Center bombing in another country and successfully bring him back without extradition problems, and he'll be arraigned tomorrow morning in New York, and then there'll be a short press conference, I'm sure, afterwards that will give some facts out.
If you want to give us a preview tonight, I'm sure.
No, I have to be very careful.
We'll all keep it off the record. We can turn the cameras off, I'm sure.
I cannot upstage Mr. Fox. He would never forgive me. But there again, it's an excellent example of the international effort, the international cooperation with countries that in the past have not been that forthright and forthcoming. And I think, again, there's a resolve in a lot of countries. During Desert Storm, we expected tremendous increase in Iraqi-sponsored terrorism. And there was some increase, but nowhere near what we were expecting. I mean, a drop in the bucket compared to what we expected. I can't give you a reason for that. It's not an exact science, as we've all indicated.
Let me open up the floor to a few questions. You've been very patient, sir. Why don't you step to the mic and give us a question?
Well, thank you very much. I'm Dr. Alexander Rossolimo. I'm president of International Strategy Associates and a visiting fellow at Harvard. My question is addressed to the entire panel. In recent months, there has been a rash of reports of fissile materials being smuggled out of the former republics of the former Soviet Union, Russia, Ukraine, the Baltic countries. In particular, double-purpose materials which can be used both in civilian and military applications. In Germany alone, over 100 individuals were arrested in conjunction with such smuggling. My question is, what could international terrorists do with such fissile materials? How grave is the danger? What is the U.S. doing about it? And what else should we be doing about it?
I'll be glad to lead off actually answering that question, since I'm co-authored a book that's on the question of nuclear weapons in the former Soviet Union, so I can't really hide on this one. Others may find what I say provocative. This is a very serious problem, but we haven't realized the full potential of the danger yet. Now, we don't know what we don't know. But the arrests in Germany and some of the other incidents that involve smuggling of radioactive material in Europe do not involve usable amounts of plutonium, nor do they involve a highly enriched uranium of the kind that would be needed to make into an atomic bomb. They are not special nuclear materials, such as would be cannibalized from, say, a nuclear warhead that had been seized from the former Soviet arsenal. It was very important, and we are reassured by the fact that all tactical nuclear weapons have been withdrawn, in our view, as the Russians have said, back to the Russian Federation. These were the ones that were most susceptible to being converted to unauthorized use or cannibalized for export. Some criminals are trying to sell radioactive materials using minute quantities of materials that are themselves not really fissile materials or usable fissile materials. But the danger is definitely there. There are substantial smuggling rings that would be glad and have tried to smuggle uranium that would in turn need reprocessing and a number of other specialized processes to make into fissile material. But the market is there. The criminal networks to service that market exist, which place an extraordinarily high premium on securing the stockpiles of fissile material where they exist. Because if that security should break down even slightly, it would be all the infrastructure to get that material to the places where we don't want it to go is already in being. So I'm not trying to downplay the seriousness of the situation, but I have not read about anything that indicates that the problem is, that the potential for this problem has been realized yet.
And based on my experience of dealing with terrorists directly, I don't know of too many groups that would want to get involved in something, looking for some type of public support. That's not the way you get some type of movement going, is to design or fashion a nuclear device when fertilizer is much more available and unfortunately is sometimes just as effective.
Let me just add one thing, though. What all of these freelancers and smugglers are doing, however, is procuring the materials not to assemble their own bombs, but rather on behalf of other countries, particularly Iran. And Iran probably today is a country that within a decade, if not stopped, will have a weapons-grade bomb available. And the fact is, this goes to the heart of the issue regarding state-sponsored terrorism. Iran today has a whole network of supporters around the world. Sheikh Abdul Rahman in New York City, his group, the Jamaat Ismailiyah, is an Islamic fundamentalist group. It is in no way a stooge of the Iranian government. It is an Islamic fundamentalist group primarily based out of Cairo and Egypt. However, over the last 5 to 7 years, it has received substantial funds from Iran. Now, to the extent Iran continues to use its network of money, embassies, supporters, religious institutions to foment, inspire, and instigate acts of violence against the West, that is the address for terrorism. It's not in Europe, it's not in Asia, it's not in New York City, it's in Tehran. And to the extent that the United States really ultimately cracks down on terrorism, it will have to confront Iran in a much more serious and systematic way than it has confronted it in the past. And I can say things a lot easier than Wayne can or than Dr. Long can because, well, Dr. Long is no longer in government, so he's as free as me. So he can't get fired. But I have the leisure of saying things that people in government can't say. However, this is a dilemma now, because to the extent that policymakers confront Iran, they run the danger of driving Iran further away from the West. That is based on a presumption that somehow Iran can be tamed. It's my belief Iran cannot be tamed, and that all of its efforts at interrupting the West have continued essentially unimpeded over the last couple of years.
Just to add a quick comment on Steve's point, because in the Iranian case, the only thing they lack is the fissile material. They have the technical infrastructure and the scientific expertise to make use of it if they could get it. So I just wanted to underscore his point, but also mention that Iran is very high on the list and is a very urgent problem. Probably higher on the list, as Mr. Krakowski pointed out, is North Korea, which also has its own ties to a number of terrorist groups, and of course to Iran, which is a major trading partner of North Korea for a variety of things, illicit trade.
Could
Syria.
Could I interject something as a member of the panel? It isn't just nuclear terrorism, it's what we call NBC, which adds biological and chemical doomsday weapons. And in part for some of the reasons given here, the severity of the risk is very low that a terrorist group can get a hold of nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons and use them to blackmail a country or a region. And it's low for a number of reasons. One that Wayne said was that most groups have a constituency, and very few constituencies would support using these tactics even for a goal they agree to. And so that's a very powerful constraint. There are other constraints. There are technical constraints for groups, and in fact, the technical constraints of getting a nuclear device are even greater than getting a biological or chemical device. So if you're going to choose between the three, why don't you go for one of the easier ones? Now, that said, that the risk of nuclear, chemical, or biological terrorism is very low, the downside risk of it happening is so high that even if the chances are 1 in 1,000, you can't take that chance, because the results are just, you don't want to even contemplate them. So you have to take them seriously, and our country does. I've been on a couple of simulations where, remember the one where we wiped out Detroit? Yeah. We dropped an agent into, not a person, a chemical agent into the Great Lakes and let it come down the river where all the water supply was and killed half of Michigan. No press, this was not real, this was just a simulation. But the object of that was to attune people who are responsible for these kind of things to what could happen. The reason that we did this in such secrecy is obvious, because even though people have to be aware of them, the actual chances of these happening are very, very small. Now, there are two things here that we're talking about, though. One is whether a terrorist group can get some of these devices and use them in the way in which we are talking about anti-terrorism, which is not very probable. However, there are governments who are much better able to try to get these devices. And in fact, Iraq had chemical and biological weapons that they didn't use, and were much farther along on their nuclear development than we knew about. Iran is working very hard, so is Pakistan. India has a bomb, Israel has a bomb, North Korea is trying to get a bomb. South Africa probably is pretty close to having a bomb. And nuclear proliferation at the end of the Cold War is a very, very major problem facing our government. I would just say categorically, though, or taxonomically, it is not a terrorism problem. It is another kind of problem, and more in the defense area of that spectrum from low intensity conflict. That's pretty high intensity.
Yes, I was hoping that Dr. Long would stay enough so that I could ask this question. Okay, it's visitors that come to Harvard through the Marshal's office. We see about 600 to 700 USIA international visitors, as well as other visitors invited by Harvard. And my question is, what kind of action, this is to the whole panel, but first to Dr. Long, what kind of action do you recommend the U.S. should take to prevent terrorism in the United States, to U.S. citizens abroad, and the world at large? And as part of that, what role do you envision that the United Nations, NGOs, and other international institutions should play in preventing terrorism now and in the future?
That would take about 4 hours to address. Let me just say, and I'm sorry I do have to go, let me just say very quickly that I will restate what I said earlier. I think the problem facing our government is one of managing a problem, not solving it. We must get it to manageable proportions, and to do that, that will require all of the resources we've been talking about: intelligence, law enforcement, diplomacy, politics, the whole raft of them, and that it must be international. It cannot be unilateral. And only that way can we keep this thing done. And I think that the last 10 years have proven that that is a wise policy, because that's really the direction we've been taking. I'm sorry I can't give you any more time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Long. At the microphone here. Were you waiting for a chance?
Yes. I'm Matt Anestis. I'm a sophomore at the college and a member of the Institute of Politics right over there. My question has been somewhat addressed by Mr. Emerson, but I'd like the rest of the panel to comment as well. I was wondering if the World Trade Center incident is linked to Iran or whatever country it ends up being linked to. What the United States, what would be the most effective response for the United States to take, or the best response?
Please, after you. Well, all right. You want me to start, or do you want to?
Be my guest.
Go ahead, Dr.
Oh, you'll let him off the hook here. Yes.
I don't know why I should do that, but anyway. The answer is not an easy one. That's why everybody's looking at the other in terms of answering. But and I would put it to you this way. Part of what the response to terrorism is at any given point has to take into account the track record previously. And the track record of the United States, in other words, states engage in this kind of behavior because they are weaker, because they don't have the means to use the other traditional tools of policy to achieve their objectives, and because they are very self-centered in the way in which they look at things, especially true of revolutionary states. So I think Iran today, the Soviet Union in the earlier years, not that the Soviet Union mellowed completely later in its career, but still at an early stage it's one thing. And so if the perception is that the target is basically a comfortable, or wants a comfortable existence undisturbed, if its policymakers are unwilling to make hard decisions, you know, you get paid the big bucks, you're supposed to make the big decisions. If they're unwilling to do that, then is when you get terrorism and bolder terrorism and so forth. The United States, and Steve mentioned the responses that the United States took against terrorist sponsors. I think, I cannot really think of exceptions. We're against states that, or sponsors that were judged to be either weak or weaker or isolated. The United States never really got serious with regard to Syria, never really got serious with regard to the Soviet bloc sponsorship. It looked the other way, and it was not alone in that. I think the West Europeans were even worse. But that established a track record. Therefore, feeling of impunity, which is justified every time there's another act. Therefore, response now, one, has to be much greater than it would have been earlier. Two, it will have to be sustained. Now, in terms of the spectrum, that is to say, one response will then yield perhaps several other acts of terrorism saying, well, you want to play the game, we'll continue. So we would have to be persistent because people will criticize us. So you see, you did that, it didn't solve the problem. The problem is not a short-term one, certainly not now. So we have to go we will have to be persistent. That is number one. Number two, the response will be at a higher level than it would otherwise have been. And the level, the spectrum here is from basically submission to terrorism and concession to demands to outright conventional warfare. I think neither is necessary. Probably neither is advisable. But none of the options should be ruled out. I will say this much and then I will stop because I don't want to be too specific. Two can play the game. Not that I am advocating terrorism, but there are various so-called unconventional methods that can be brought to bear to exercise pressure on countries like Iran. And there's a wide variety of those. Some we can do, some we cannot now do without some adjustment to legislation.
Would either of you care to comment on the question?
I can say from the investigative standpoint, in the rule of law standpoint, we have no evidence or indication tying the Trade Center bombing to any known international group. I don't think there's any doubt that there's a thread of extremism, Islamic extremism, that's going to be weaved into the basis for this. But we have no specific evidence or intelligence tying it, and we certainly don't have any intelligence or evidence tying the shootings outside of the CIA in Langley to any identified group. As a matter of fact, we can't tie it beyond one individual in the CIA shooting.
Let me just make a point here. If the case is finally determined that the World Trade Center bombing and the shooting outside the CIA were contained within the United States, they started within the United States and they ended with the U.S., then it means that there is another phenomenon, perhaps even a more dangerous phenomenon, of local homegrown terrorists who traditionally have not been suspects in the counter-terrorist arena as the FBI would define them, or as any intelligence agency would define them, and therefore unsusceptible to surveillance at this point and to detection. This could be the beginning of a major problem. I'm not saying, and I don't think we can say that this is going to happen, but to the extent that these two events are indicative of a wave of homegrown, religious-inspired terrorism, the United States is going to have to change the rules of the game entirely. And I don't think that the weapons that the FBI has had traditionally are going to be sufficient to fight the type of battle you will need to fight.
I can't argue with that.
Let me just add, if I may, just one quick point, because I think that there is a little clarity that needs to be added. I don't want to take from the question. But the problem in terms of legal connection. Now, terrorists, if what I said before is kept in mind, they do not want a clear-cut signature. And therefore, in order to motivate, there are all sorts of people around who are very willing to do all sorts of criminal acts. And just in the well-known saying, you know, in terms of the mafia, the boss or the don does not say, go kill so-and-so. He said, gee, it would be nice if so-and-so were not around. It's such a problem. And so that in international terrorist lingo, you don't, I think it's a big mistake to focus, as people tend to do, overly on, and part of the problem is, of course, we do think legally and we treat those things more legally than politically, but it's a big mistake to focus so much on the connections, because terrorism is not dependent on individual acts, it's in terms of creating certain atmosphere.
Just a concluding comment. From what little I know about organized crime investigations, the Dons actually do not issue hit orders the way Henry II called for the assassination of Thomas à Becket. Actually, it turns out they do say, go kill somebody, at least in a lot of the wiretaps that I've heard about. They're awfully explicit. But then the question is as to whether you can assign state responsibility if you don't have evidence of state responsibility, creates some rather fundamental ethical and legal dilemmas which we haven't really explored very much, but which do need to be noted. It also is worth noting that getting into this as a public policy issue, a lot of the hypotheses here have not been rigorously tested, which is if the hypothesis is we've been soft on terrorism, therefore terrorism is going up, it's not clear that actually our policy has been that obviously soft to a lot of the people in the region. Certainly it doesn't seem soft to the Libyans, who are currently under UN sanctions that may be ratcheted up. It is, may not be harsh enough, but it doesn't seem soft to the Iranians, who know that terrorism and state sponsorship is one of the major obstacles to improvement of their relations with the entire Western world. Nor does it seem particularly soft to the Syrians, who understood that this was one of the issues they would have to address when, in the aftermath of the Gulf War, they sought to curry favor with the United States and get on the ins with us instead of on the outs. Now, whether or not any of these policies would satisfy a rigorous anti-terrorist stance is not at all clear. Nor is it clear, though, that whatever the deficiencies in our policy, that they are causally linked to an increase in terrorism. A lot of these hypotheses are indeed very murky, and I think it's worth examining them very carefully. Gentleman here has a question.
My name is Alan Bennell, and I was just wondering if anyone would like to forecast what the, how the Clinton administration might deal with the threat of terrorism. Might be too specific a question, but.
Let me make a specific point here. I noted that yesterday a senior counterterrorism official gave an interview on Background to some reporters in Washington, and for the first time stated that the Lockerbie Pan Am 103 bombing was not, that the U.S. government did not believe that only Libya was the first and only party involved, that it was possible that Syria and Iran were also involved in the early stages of the planning for the bombing of Pan Am 103. To my mind, that was the first positive sign I've seen out of this administration, that it's willing to examine all the political parties regardless of the potential political consequences. I think, frankly, despite the incredible detailed work that the Justice Department did and the FBI in doing the Lockerbie investigation, the fact is that the Bush administration breathed a heavy sigh of relief when they pinned the blame entirely on Libya and took away the responsibility from Syria and Iran. Because essentially it's much easier, and this has been the whole problem of U.S. counterterrorism policy, it's selectivity. It's much easier to hit Libya and to punish Libya than it is to punish Iran or Syria because of other geopolitical interests. So to the extent that this new administration is willing to consider Iranian and Syrian complicity in the bombing of Pan Am 103 shows, to my mind, an act of political will and courage that was not seen in the previous administration.
I don't agree. I'm a government employee, et cetera, but believe me, there is no evidence, no intelligence existing to this date that other than Libya was involved in that crime. And believe me, we haven't closed the investigation. I'd be glad to take it to any other country. But believe me, it does not exist. And anyone that's giving background indicating that, I'd like to know what their experience has been in the terrorism, counterterrorism field. And I'm not controversial usually, but that gets close to home. We've put too many hours, and the Brits and a lot of other services have put too much time and effort into it, not to come up and call the shot correctly to date. And there again, I'm not excluding that the investigation is completed.
I just want to say one thing very clearly, that the investigation which ultimately indicted the Libyans, I'm not taking issue with, and neither did the senior counterterrorism official, who has to remain anonymous on the basis of which he granted the interview. But the interview, which was granted, specifically pointed out that the early stages in fall of 1988, when a German-based terrorist group was apprehended in Frankfurt, may have been the actual origins of the events that ultimately culminated in the bombing of Pan Am 103. Because at that point, there were 5 Syrian-manufactured terrorist bombs retrieved from various safe houses in Germany, and there was evidence that Iran and Syria had been planning some type of event at that point. What happened since that time was that the investigation found that the Libyans carried out the attack, and I don't take issue with that. But I think what the investigator was saying yesterday was that the fact that Syria and Iran had actually contemplated downing an American airliner 2 months before the bombing of Pan Am 103 shows that the slate could not be wiped clean with regards to those two countries.
One of the problems we have is that probably any given week, in the last several years, there's been a threat out there, either publicized or non-publicized, to take down aircraft along those lines. There's one existing as we speak right now. It's been going on for several weeks. And then the odds of something happening during that particular threat, and then it gets read into that. At the beginning of the Trade Center bombing, quite frankly, we were steered in the direction of another source organization having to do with Yugoslavia. The first claim that came in was a claim out of the Yugoslavian situation. And quite frankly, that was a hot topic for some time, as were several other groups, from Tamils to Sikhs. There's no lack of groups to put together with it, but that occurs frequently. But there again, in the end, generally when you're focusing on the right group. And there again, I don't disagree. If we came up with evidence or intelligence indicating that Syria was the ultimate sponsor, we'd take it there. We see it connected with several other incidents of the like kind, UTA and some other incidents, no question about it.
Sir.
My name is Trey Grayson. I'm a junior at the college, and my question is a little specific. My roommate, who is a Sikh actually, is spending the semester in India, and I just got a postcard from him today, and he asked simply, what's the deal with the World Trade Center? And so that made me wonder, what kind of coverage did this event receive abroad? Normally these events, terroristic acts, occur abroad, and they're covered here, and if we can learn anything, or does that provide any insight as to how it was covered in different countries?
Maybe it was covered there about as much as we covered the Calcutta bombings here.
Yeah.
I'd say Waco and the Trade Center bomb. I was in New Zealand when the bomb went off, and I mean it was live on CNN International extensively, 24 hours a day. Actually, Waco probably got more coverage than the Trade Center bombing because there were Australians inside.
Is that just on CNN, but how about the foreign press? Not necessarily CNN, but newspapers, media services.
Well, you have to understand, in the world today, the American presence, the media presence, is such a dominant force that even though terrorist bombs go off all the time in the Middle East, I mean, even in Israel and Egypt, they were focused on this. So it's because of the U.S., the heavy American media presence in the world. And CNN notwithstanding, we have the ability to make the American angle stick and make our experience seem like it's more important than other people's.
Does that then make their actions in America more effective now than they used to be maybe 10 years ago?
It's a good question, to the extent that they generated this type of publicity. I mean, to give you an idea, CNN, I think I should ask the cameras to stop rolling on this one. CNN has assigned at least 7 or 8 correspondents and producers full-time to work on the Trade Center bombing, or trade bomb. See, you're getting the lingo down quickly. And the fact is that it accounted, I'm not being cynical here, but it accounted for 6 deaths. The fact is that those 6 deaths happen every minute in some other catastrophe or some other type of shooting event in the United States all the time. And yet CNN hardly pays any attention to those events. The fact is there has been an inordinate, extraordinary, disproportionate amount of attention focused on the World Trade Center bombing for a variety of reasons. Terrorism sells. There's the hunt. There's the FBI. There's, you have all of the great mixtures. It's why novels sell. And yet, unfortunately, at the end of the day, when a terrorist who plotted this out and sees this extraordinary publicity, he's got a lot of bang for his buck.
And not very hard bang to build. Sir.
Hi, my name is Greg Elkman. I'm here on a fellowship this year. And this is directed to Mr. Gilbert. One of the hot topics is the structure of the intelligence system in the post-Cold War. What is your impression for both resources and structure, how the present intelligence system is set up to handle terrorism and anti-terrorism intelligence?
I think it's vastly improved from when I was involved with it 10 or 12 years ago. I think we're all taking resource hits. I've reprogrammed, and it's been publicized, 400 FBI agents from counterintelligence over to violent crime, in quotes. And that's an appropriate response to the demise of the Soviet Union. But there's still a substantial threat from a counterintelligence standpoint that we still address. It's still a major program. Counterterrorism, the lack of activity definitely has an effect over the years. But but we still have a lot of cases going that don't get the daily publicity. We have a lot of groups that we have to keep an eye on. We have immigration laws that really cause us some great concern, give us a lot of headaches. And if you saw, I'll give a plug to 60 Minutes, the 60 Minutes political asylum bit a couple of weeks ago. I mean, it's far worse than that, believe me. And the people involved in the Trade Center bombing are good examples of some real problems. And I'm not blaming INS. I'm just saying resource-wise, they have a severe problem.
Sir.
My name is Raymond Fedors. I go to the Harvard Graduate School, the CSS program. My question is about biological warfare. Over the past decade, there's been some speculation about the source of AIDS as being the results of some biological warfare research done either in the U.S. or overseas. Could anyone comment on that? Is there any credible evidence that this might be the case?
I'll make a quick comment on it, which is we know that this was a subject of Soviet disinformation campaigns sponsored from Moscow, which deliberately planted such stories in third world media for reasons best understood in Moscow. I'd also add in that context that these sorts of frightening stories about Moscow's secret activities and the terror network and Soviet sponsorship of international terrorism actually turn out to have a decent basis in fact, now that we know a good deal more about what was going on, especially in both the Soviet Union and in East Germany. With the disclosure of archives and access to additional people, turns out that there were a lot of people in the Soviet Union and East Germany who were involved with international terrorist groups in a significant way. And this disinformation campaign is just a small example of a much larger set of black operations being mounted by the Soviet security services. Now, whether or not that story would have gotten started and achieved the currency that it's achieved on its own without the help of this disinformation campaign, I don't know.
It's not a matter of a genetics lab having an experiment that went out of hand?
No, here let me add, because I was involved on the Pentagon side in dealing with Soviet disinformation and then the American public diplomacy, and that is exactly how he put it. Very massive. Actually, an interesting thing that it continued way after Gorbachev's coming to power and was being addressed as late as 86, 87 by the U.S. government in terms of getting the Soviets to.
Besides, anyone who's studied biological warfare would tell us that this is not even a pathway for where you develop biological weapons. And actually, the only major country I know of that's been in the business of continuing to work on biological weapons in the last 10 years is the Soviet Union, which is actually now beginning to surface even in the Russian press as the full story of the anthrax outbreak in Sverdlovsk is now at Ekaterinburg is being revealed. The United States hasn't had an active biological weapons program in decades. But the kinds of things you develop for biological weapons would not have anything to do with genetic diseases that would take 15 years to disable someone. I mean, it's difficult to find any sensible way to have the rumor make sense, even with the most extreme conspiracy theories of American behavior.
Certain societies don't feel time's an element, though.
No, and certain societies have views of the United States that I can only begin to understand. I can begin to understand them only intellectually.
You might be interested in we've had, me personally and my division, have had extensive contacts with the old first directorate and second directorate, internal and external services, the SVRR, which is the successor to the KGB, in terms of them wanting exchanges, both in information, training, practical intelligence, in areas of organized crime, counter-narcotics, and counter-terrorism. It's been an interesting 9 or 10 months, although they still continue their intelligence activities against us, which is a problem we have to deal with. But there are some significant changes and some significant exchanges, quite frankly. I mean, I've had FBI agents, over there, and they've had people here, and we actually sit at the same table, and Hoover may not have rolled over, but he's up on one shoulder, type of thing. But it is a very much changing world, but I've seen no evidence in that. These gentlemen are much more knowledgeable of that side of the coin.
Sir?
Would reducing American support for Israel substantially reduce the threat of terrorism against the United States?
I beg your pardon, sir?
Would reducing American support for Israel substantially reduce the threat of terrorism against the United States? And along that line, I realize that would be a kind of conceding to extortion, but it seems to me that historically the Muslims have in fact frustrated Western incursions for centuries. They have survived the British, the French, the Russians, and in fact it might simply be a matter of postponing the inevitable to try to continue support for Israel if in fact that has an impact on terrorism in the United States.
I would answer no, absolutely no. I think that this is, the question, I think, reflects in part a sort of a mirror imaging, a projecting of American attitudes onto others. It assumes that the Iranians don't have objectives.
But their objective is against Israel, isn't it?
No, they have far greater objectives. As a matter of fact, I would say that Israel to the Iranians is a very secondary objective, very secondary, maybe tertiary. They use Israel as a means of influencing others in the region and building themselves up as the dominant power towards the north, towards the east, west, and south. So that Israel or any other demand that terrorists make, I think, simply encourages more of the same. And whereas you may have initially, for instance, a purely regional appetite, if that is encouraged through these types of things, the appetite will grow much larger. Many of the states in the area that do not like the Iranians one bit will cave in if they perceive that there is a cave-in by the more powerful states.
Mr. Emerson, would you like to comment on that?
Just real quickly, I think to the extent the U.S. caves into terrorism, I mean, it's the same thing with what happened during the Iran arms for hostages. To the extent that the Iranians saw that the United States was willing to sell arms for hostages, it only encouraged and emboldened the Iranians to carry out further acts of terrorism, including taking more hostages. So I don't think you'll solve anything by capitulating so brazenly to terrorists. I think you only magnify the problem.
Folks, I think we're about out of time for tonight's presentation. I thank you for your presence, for your helpful questions, but most of all, I want to thank our panelists who've joined us here tonight for an informative and enlightening discussion.